Hello, lovely ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jen Gerson, and this is On the Line, our second episode of our brand new podcast. This is an interview-style podcast, and if you haven't seen us before, you should check us out at www.readtheline.ca. We're very excited to launch this second product. Today, we are asking the question, how serious is Donald Trump about turning Canada into a 51st state, and more importantly, why? What does it have to do with Arctic sovereignty and security? To answer those questions, we have Rob Huebert, a professor of poli-science at the University of Calgary and the interim director of the Centre of Military Security and Strategic Studies. In case you don't know him, he's probably also one of Canada's foremost experts on Arctic issues. So stick around. It's a really great interview, and I think you're going to find it's very enjoyable and interesting. This is On the Line.
This message is brought to you by the Motion Picture Association of Canada. For decades, Ottawa controlled what is Canadian and what isn't when it comes to series and movies available to Canadians. The rules are out of date and costing Canadians opportunities. It's time for Ottawa to focus on helping Canadian film and TV workers and encourage efforts to showcase Canada. More opportunities for Canadians, more common sense. Your choice, not Ottawa's. Learn more at mpa-canada.org.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the On the Line podcast. Welcome to our second episode of On the Line. Today, we are talking to Rob Huebert, who is a professor of political science at the University of Calgary and an interim director of the Centre of Military Security and Strategic Studies. And Dr. Huebert, Mr. Huebert, whichever you prefer, I think it's also safe to say that you are one of Canada's foremost experts on Arctic sovereignty and security issues. Is that reasonable?
Well, I've spent a career looking at the issue. So inevitably, if you spend it that long, you get a little bit of an expertise. But this is the major focus of my research since the 1980s is really addressing the issue of both Arctic sovereignty and Arctic security. So as a result, I think the allegations probably fit.
Excellent. Okay, so the reason why I got really interested to talk to you is because you were quoted in an article along with someone whom we haven't really heard about in some years hence, and that is Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is probably best known as being kind of a former Donald Trump's former advisor in the White House, and I think he's also very much the architect of a lot of the cultural forces that have pushed Trump into the White House, not only for the first but for the second time. Love him or hate him, he's a very controversial figure. If you don't know who he is, look him up. But I thought the Global News did a really, really smart thing this week in that they reached out to Steve Bannon and they sat down for a talk with him because they were trying to ascertain the degree to which Donald Trump's sovereignty jibes and threats toward Greenland, toward Canada are real or just trolling. And Steve Bannon gave an absolutely fascinating interview and a fascinating response that for me allowed several pieces to click into place, because I think since Donald Trump came to power, he's talked about Panama, he's talked about Canada, he's talked about Greenland. And if you don't know the context in which he's discussing the stuff, it seems really weird and random. But Steve Bannon explains it that what Donald Trump is really concerned about is Arctic sovereignty and Arctic security. And the reason why he's focusing on Canada, Panama, and Greenland is because he's trying to create a hemispheric bloc, a kind of corridor of economic and military control that goes from the North Pole essentially to South America. And I want to read a quote from Bannon to you, Huebert, and I'd like to get Dr. Huebert, Mr. Huebert, whichever you prefer, and I'd like to get your response to it. And it's this quote right here. He's not trolling, Bannon counters. He's, quote, really thought this through. Quote, "Let me be brutally frank. Geostrategically, you," by this he means Canada, "don't really have an option but to join us. If you want your sovereignty, because from the north, from the Arctic, it's going to get encroached in a great power competition that you don't have the ability to win." And when I read that quote, I got to be honest with you, I had a bit of a oh shit moment, because he's right. Love him or hate him, he's right, isn't he?
Well, the problem is that And we're increasingly seeing this in the second term, that some of the way that Trump will frame an issue has a basis in reality. His solutions are the problem. I mean, in many ways, the solutions, including the ones on Arctic sovereignty and security, actually will make the situation worse. But there's been a developing, some would say, a return to the Cold War. I've argued in the past the Cold War never really ended. That situates the Arctic as one of the, if not the most important strategic location. It has always been since the early 1960s, when both the Soviets and the Americans were able to achieve the ability to fire nuclear weapons through both missiles and bombers. The Arctic was the location over which both those missiles and bombers would fly. And so that's fighting a nuclear war. When we realized that we needed to basically develop what everybody knows as nuclear deterrence, which is, if I can convince the other guy that you'll die with me if you attack me, basically, you fire your missiles at me, I'll fire at you, we'll all die. And that knowledge has stopped nuclear war from occurring from the great powers, but it's over the Arctic. We need to know if the Russians or Soviets were launching over the Arctic. That's why we created the DEW line that led to the North Warning Line. The Soviets/Russians have had similar type of capabilities. But here's the kicker. The Soviets/Russians have realized what the American capabilities are. And they've basically, since 2002, that's 2 years after Putin takes power, so it's very much tied to Putin, when he decides to rebuild Russia into a great power, the type of weapon systems they are starting to challenge the old defensive systems. And this is something that many observers have made. I mean, Bannon's by far just the most recent addition. The American commander of NORTHCOM and NORAD, back when he was commander, was warning the new Russian delivery systems are undetectable for the American systems, ergo the possibility the Russians could launch a surprise attack. All of that is to say, the Arctic is one of the most critical strategic locations. It's been since 62. It lost a little bit of that importance when the Soviets/Russians became impoverished when they imploded in 1988. But since 2002, 2003, Putin has been determined to return to that. And ergo, it's very clear that it is a very dangerous location in which you have to defend against. What adds to the problem is, starting in 2015, we start seeing the Chinese starting to becoming interested in the region from a military perspective. They were interested before in terms of science, in terms of resources, but it's 2015 that they send their first naval surface fleets into the Aleutian Islands. Now, albeit that's not really the Arctic, but we've seen since 2015 a continuance of Chinese efforts to learn how to operate farther and farther north. The most recent development a year ago was that they did it in cooperation with the Russians. So it's a geopolitical triangle between the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese. And therefore, to talk about the Arctic in the type of context that Bannon is talking is in fact correct. The problem is the solutions that, of course, the Americans seem to be pursuing right now, and this is the part that should terrify everybody, seems to be directed of undermining our ability to have that security. So, I mean, when you talk about Greenland, and it's important to realize that Trump talked about this in the first term. Yeah, I mean, this isn't sort of a brain fart that all of a sudden says Greenland, it comes out of nowhere. He talked about doing this in the first term, but got dissuaded and other issues came up, so they never pursued it. So it's not a first time he's had this consideration. The Danes and the Greenland home government have, in fact, allowed the Americans to greatly expand a military base that they've had on the northern tip of Greenland. It used to be called Thule, now it's called Pennatuk, where, in fact, the Americans have had no problems in terms of being able to put into their military surveillance of the Soviets/Russians. They've just expanded it as a air base. And once again, the Greenlandic Home Rule and the Danish government has said yes. But if Trump starts talking, oh, well, we've got such a problem, we're going to go take it over, all of a sudden you hurt that relationship that has been so great. So you're actually playing into the hands of our enemies, you're weakening it. Because if you cause distrust amongst the Greenlandic population, if you cause the Danes to then start questioning American commitment, doesn't that favor our enemies? Now, let's go to Canada. Trump
Well, before we get into Canada, the first thing I just want to explain for people who don't necessarily understand strategic studies or understand this, they're probably thinking about the Mercator map, right?
Yep.
You
Hmm.
picture a map of the world, you're picturing left to right, Russia, China,
Flat.
Europe, North
Hmm.
America right across the straits. So the Arctic and the Antarctic are kind of, they seem like leftover bits, like
Yeah.
remainders after long division. But remember that the globe is there, the map is actually on a globe, and it's actually not flat like that. So the major buffer that's keeping America and Canada divided from Russia, and increasingly depending on how China places itself, is actually the Arctic, because of course those missiles go over the North Pole, which is why the Arctic is a strategically important position. And I think on top of the place that it holds just from a military map point of view, the other thing that I think is worth pointing out here is also that with climate change, we are expecting a lot of that passage to be much more easily passable in coming years, if not generations, than it has been previously, which opens up that potential route for trade routes, if not military incursion, which complicates our entire relationship with a spot of land that is frankly sparsely populated and not often thought about even by Canadians. Is that a safe way of putting it?
It's perfectly fair. Sorry for missing that point. You have to think about a globe, a ball, and that
Right.
is always the location of how the missiles work. And to your point about climate change, this is the part that confounds our policymakers because you're absolutely right. It's not just simply about opening access, but the melting climate or the melting ice, the warming temperatures that are happening at a greater rate in the Arctic region are fueling into the greater changes that are occurring. So we actually face two existential threats. We face the existential threat of climate change, which all scientific models prove that we are, in fact, going to be facing rising sea level rises because of the melting ice off of Greenland, because of the effect it'll have on our circulatory system in terms of currents. The problem we face is that if you're going to try to address climate change, you need to have cooperation amongst the Americans, Chinese, and Russians. But then you switch to the other existential threat, which is geopolitical and based on an ever growing, increasing threat of nuclear weapons in terms of deterrent slash nuclear war fighting. And then all of a sudden, the people that you need to cooperate are exactly the people that you're trying to protect yourself from. And the question that nobody has figured out is how do you do both at the same time? And
Right.
that becomes one of the critical, and that's all about the ultimate Canadian security, not just Arctic security, security writ large.
So, I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying is that by undermining the relationship with his allies, that Donald Trump is actually posing or accelerating perhaps an existential threat that we're going to have to face.
Yeah,
If I'm going to
absolutely.
play if I'm going to play devil's advocate, I'm going to look at the last 50, 60 years of Canadian history, and I'm going to say you have fundamentally underpowered your military. You have no defensive capabilities in the Arctic, realistically, or very limited ones. You treat your military as the same way that you treat the socks that you wear to geopolitical summits. Like, this is a superficial thing that you think that you exist solely to throw, a couple of bodies into a weird peacekeeping situation once in a while in order to be smug and say you've done your part. But if we're talking about an actual great power standoff, if Russia decides to take the Arctic, there's dick all we can do about it as Canadians because we've chosen to make strategic spending priorities where we have, and those strategic spending priorities have not centered around our basic security and sovereignty. So if I'm an American and I'm looking at a potential major and even nuclear war play out just north of my border, just above my hat, I would have to look at the Canadian situation and be like, you guys have not been reliable military partners. You haven't kept up your end of the bargain. Therefore, the only way that I can secure my own geopolitical position from a military point of view is to absorb you. Is that wrong logic?
Well, I mean, it's not wrong logic. The problem is, of course, two factors. The first one is, of course, is what you have described is very apropos in the last 10 or so years. To talk that we have dropped the ball, well, even worse, we've identified the threat because if you go back to 2017, when, of course, the Canadian Defense Policy, Strong, Secure, Engage came out, We very much recognized that there was a need to modernize NORAD precisely for the reasons that we've talked about, the growing concerns about the growing Russian nuclear capabilities and their delivery systems. Of course, everybody knows 2017, we did nothing. The defense paper said, just wait till the second term. We know, of course, COVID came and that changed spending expenditures. Of course, it didn't change spending expenditures in both Russia and China. I mean, again, different scale of comparison in terms of what we're talking about. Nevertheless, we then fast forward. We, of course, have within Canada, we were pretending that we've always pretended that the Ukrainian war starts in 2022, when in fact it starts in 2014. Remember, we call it an illegal occupation, so we're deliberately downplaying the Russian threat. I don't know what an illegal occupation is as opposed to war. Ukrainian soldiers died defending Ukrainian territory in 2014. By any sort of political science, strategic studies definition, that's a war. The ongoing battles that were occurring in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, yeah, you can say it was little green men. We know that those were Russian special forces troops. And so, again, we downplayed it. Now, having said all that, we promised to do something in 2017, didn't do anything. We promised to do something in 2019 when the Arctic policy came back. It said, look at our defense policy, but it never really was clear. And even in 2022, when we finally say, oh, well, I guess the second phase of the war really is a war, and so therefore let's start doing things. And you start slowly seeing, but remember, even when we have a defense minister who's taking real actions, and most people were crediting Arnett with actually moving the line in terms of NORAD modernization, what happens to her? She gets moved to a department where she then has to cut every single thing that she's done. So we see this sequencing. So you're correct there. But if we go back historically, and this is the part where, of course, Trump is not going to pay any attention to, from a historical perspective, we worked out major solutions for the protection of the North American continent. And this is going back, of course, to 1957, when it was really a Canadian idea to create NORAD, which was to basically, it's an agreement we have between Canada and U.S. to defend and treat Canada's airspace as one. No other country really has this close of integration between the two militaries. Our Air Force and their Air Force, basically in any action that is required, if it's responding to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, if it's responding to Chinese balloons that are on a spy mission over Canada, it's a seamless border, and our militaries have very close interaction. From the period of 57 all the way up to 68, we had a very substantial Air Force in terms of the aerospace defense and aerospace detection. So we actually spent a lot of money, relatively speaking, so we can do it. Of course, in 1969, we have a change of government. It was Trudeau's father, and we start seeing the decrease of expenditures in both NORAD and NATO commitments because basically we go in a slightly different direction. Now, again, we can in fact spend money because we look at some of the decisions that were made. For example, the Harper decision to build Arctic offshore patrol vessels to give us a better presence. Now, those are primarily built for constabulary duties, not war fighting, but they're still a presence. They still have a capability of playing a role in the Arctic. So we can do it. We've chosen not to. And that's the problem. That is where, of course, if we have an American administration says, okay, we're just going to look at the last 5 years of what's happened. We know that there's personal disagreements between the two leaders. And I think that the type of danger that you outline is precisely how the Americans are going to think about it. But here's the kicker. If they actually moved on that, the disruption that they would cause to the existing amazing aerospace relationship that we have would be severely damaged. What Canadian military officer is going to say, okay, now you've invaded, but I'm still going to cooperate with you just as well as I've had. And all of a sudden, the Americans would have to do everything that we have been doing. And again, it's legacy. We should have had the F-35s a long time ago to replace the F-18s. We should have been buying the tankers that we are now having that we're going to be deploying to Edmonton, but to serve as basically all of the fighters that we're getting. So it's actually, even with the loss of expenditures and efforts that the Trudeau Jr. administration has had, the Americans would be creating a much greater requirement to do more. And again, the American
Okay,
forces
but
aren't unlimited.
isn't that presuming that they absorb us by military force? I
Well,
mean,
yeah.
Donald Trump was asked specifically about this, and he said, "No, no, we don't need to put tanks on the border. We'll just absorb them by economic force. We'll put them in so much economic pain that they have no choice but essentially run a succession referendum or vote to be absorbed by us."
Yep. And then it raises the question then who pays for the new resources that we are now getting in once again rebuilding. So if you did that, you're going to lose any political support within Canada saying, okay, now we will continue to build on the infrastructure that we have. So we've created the worst of all worlds for both in terms of security. So by not doing anything, we have the legacy capabilities, and it's there. We have the expertise. We've created an American administration that now is determined that somehow thinks that by economically starving us into submission, it can then take over and add to that security. The timeline to add to that would then be added that much more. And so, you don't think our enemies would be paying attention to that. And so,
So
therefore, the
then,
solution is by far worse than
yeah,
just simply taking the time to wait.
This message brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's fall 1828. The War of 1812 is long over, but for the Métis families living on Drummond Island in northern Lake Huron, the fight for home is just beginning. After years defending their territory alongside the British, the news arrives Drummond Island is now American land. Métis families face an impossible choice: stay and become Americans or leave their rightful land for the unknown. They reject American rule and choose their own destiny. Packing their belongings into canoes, these Métis paddle across the upper Great Lakes, resettling in Penetanguishene. Though uprooted, they refuse to abandon their culture, identity, and way of life. Their journey is a defining moment, one of many where the Métis chose self-determination generations before Canada even existed. To learn more, go to OntarioMétisFacts.com.
okay, so here's the question I have you. We know that things are changing, going to be changing in the Arctic in short order. We know that there's some demographic issues which might push a conflict ahead faster than it might otherwise happen. I mean, we know that the Russians, for example, have lost God knows how many able-bodied men as a result of the war in Ukraine. We know that there's been an exodus of wealth and talent out of Russia as a result of the war and conscription before the war. In short order, I mean, what are Russia's actual capabilities to launch a meaningful campaign in a place like the Arctic, strategically important as it is? And then, of course, we see similar types of internal problems in China. We know that China's suffering from their own economic challenges, and they're suffering from other similar demographic challenges. That either prevents the possibility of a major Great War conflict, or it almost certainly accelerates the timeline of a Great War conflict because there's only going to be so much time that these power blocks have to expend the bodies that they potentially have at their disposal. So what are the odds of some kind of military or kinetic standoff in the Arctic, considering the positioning that's happening right now? Where would you put that probability?
Well, those are excellent questions. And the problem that we face is no matter whose analysis you're looking at, it still will be low probability. There's nobody who's
Okay.
saying that this is something we have to be, concerned is going to be a bolt out of the blue tomorrow.
We're not seeing tanks like line
No.
up at the
And this is the critical, your question highlights a critical misunderstanding that we have. And that is, of course, that the threat to the Arctic is a maritime aerospace threat. It is not a land-based force. I mean, there were Canadian military officers that used to joke whenever they were asked about the threat from the Russians, and they'd say, well, the biggest thing I'm worried about is that if they launched an invasion of Baffin Island, is how I'm going to go rescue them once they get stuck up there. It's never been about land. At worst, possibly utilizing special forces to maybe seize specific bases like Alert or do damage at the forward operating bases in Yellowknife and Iqaluit. But it is a maritime and aerospace. So in other words, we've got to be able to defend against their missiles, against their aircraft, and against their naval units, and specifically its submarines is really what we're talking about, not surface vessels. Because everybody says, oh, well, the ice is melting, and so the navies are going to have their Jutland battle, battleship type battles. It's not about surface fleets. It's still the undersea threat. And so this often causes a lot of misperception. People say, okay, well, do the Russians have enough forces to be able to invade and take Canada? Let me be clear. That's not at all what we're talking about. Maybe special forces hitting Anchorage, and even that is highly unlikely, though the Russians do have that capability. The problem, and this is why I said it's low probability, but huge impact, is, of course, what happens if Putin gets to the point in one conflict, and this is the spillover argumentation, in Ukraine or any other location where he thinks that it would be strategically advantage to somehow blind the United States for a short period. And this is where we start talking about, well, would you do a decapitation strike? Would you take that risk? And this is why it's low probability, but it can still happen. And so the scenarios, for example, okay, so the Russians decide that they're just about to all of a sudden be pushed back in Ukraine. And so they say, well, we're going to use tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukrainian front to basically terrorize or wipe out Ukrainian resistance. And a lot of American analysts have been portraying that as a possibility. Well, if you're Putin and you're seeing sort of divide amongst the NATO allies that are being sown by the increasing actions that what Trump is doing, calling for 5% now. If he can detect that, in fact, you're divided, what you would possibly do, and this is one scenario that's put forward, you launch a EMP burst, you blind the Americans so they cannot respond to the tactical use of weapons that you're using in Ukraine. You cause panic amongst the Americans so they don't respond to you strategically, and you take the territory that you want. And you say, okay, US, NATO, what are you going to do about this now? And so you establish yourself in that context. And that is the major scenario if the Russians think that they can get by using either their Air Force, that is then using their hypersonic missiles, utilizing their submarines that can also carry cruise missiles that are very hard to detect. Can you blind the Americans and the NATO allies to allow you then to do it, to give you that basically, you're talking in terms of hours, if not maybe a day or two, just to give you the strategic advantage, to then use the nukes in Ukraine and then hold off. And so that's the nightmare scenario right now, because how are you assured that the Americans will then say, well, we're throwing our hands up, you're right, we're not going to be willing to escalate? Because then, of course, if the Americans say, no, we will escalate, we will then use our tacticals against you. And that's where the breakdown of nuclear deterrence becomes so scary. But we come back to the Arctic. As long as the Americans have the confidence that they have the detection system to determine that if a Russian SLBM or one of their cruise missiles or their Poseidon nuclear tipped torpedoes can be detected and stopped, then the Russians, the theory goes, will not launch that strike in the first place. And that's where it becomes so critically important. And I come back to my point. This is why if you turn around and have a Trump who is sowing discord amongst the NORAD alliance and the NATO alliance, those are the conditions in which, if you're an adversary, you will choose to attack. If you're Hitler, you're hoping that Stalin, Dallaire, and Dallier and Churchill can't get along, which they couldn't over the preparation for Czechoslovakia, and then you move in. And
Right.
so that's the nightmare scenario.
You're looking for the moment of peak internal chaos
Yeah.
in order to add more chaos to the fire. So firstly, when you're talking, the thing that I'm thinking is twofold. One, we have to stop thinking about a map by land when we're talking about security issues. We have
Absolutely.
to start thinking about a map by sea. So like this
And
is
aerospace.
and aerospace, but it's a map by air and sea. So and the second thing I'm thinking is, okay, so let's game theory out this scenario. Let's say that in 2 years, 18 months, we're in peak chaos. And the reason why I'm sort of saying 18 months is that I think just before the next midterms, we know that Trump is sort of his own Congress is thin. The Republicans have a very thin majority in Congress, and I think they may not have. I'd have to double check this. Anyway, this is very, very chaotic. We know they're going to be heading into a midterms amid mass chaos. We're only like 3 weeks into term one, and already it's insane. we know that Trump came to power with a bit of a shock and awe strategy. He's going to throw every executive order at the book at everybody. He's going to see how people react, and then he's going to make decisions about his next move from there. But these people are moving fast, and they are breaking things. And the consensus that they're going to have to continue that is going to start to probably fall apart before the next midterms. So give it 2 years. At this point, if the U.S. has put tariffs upon us, we're going to be really in the midst of struggling financially and psychologically as a result of that economic pain. Who knows what's happening domestically Canadian at that point? I mean, I don't make any predictions for what's happening in Canada because we're a bit of a shit show already. That's the moment where peak chaos comes. Putin or his successor says, the opportunity for us to take some territory in the Arctic is now. The Canadians are weak and the Americans are inwardly focused. I presume you have 4 or 5 sites in your head that you're imagining that the Russians would take. They essentially put boots on the ground and see assets around that particular space. They say, this is our territory now. We're now controlling the Northwest Passage, and we're going to maintain control over the passage as the ice caps melt and the passage opens up as a result of climate change. Here's my question. I know that Canada can't react to that because we realistically can't get our military forces up and running in any meaningful way in that kind of a time frame. How does America react to that?
Ugh. Well, I'll push back a little bit on the scenario. Again,
Okay.
it's not going to be so much boots on the ground. We don't
Sure.
see any capability. If you want to start talking boots on the ground, the Chinese probably have a greater aerospace amphibious capability of actually paratroopers and what would be
So
required.
let's take boots off the ground totally off the
Yeah.
table. It's cold up there anyway, and there's nothing to
They've hit the major points of control. So they've hit
Okay.
Alert, they've hit Yellowknife, they've hit Anchorage, they've hit Fairbanks, the places that, of course, allow them to blind the Americans because it wouldn't
And they've
be
hit them with
seizing territory.
EMPs, not necessarily cruise missiles here.
Yep.
Is what you're saying. Okay.
Exactly. And so at that point, we're in chaos to add even to further chaos. And so what can we do? And so this is the part that becomes so problematic because it's the type of battle you need to be prepared for beforehand. You're not going to just wing it like you could in, say, World War I, where it's just sort of like, train someone for 6 weeks and you send them over to fight in the trenches. And so basically what it is where the real damage comes in. And this is the part that's hard for us to get our minds around. It's never about, okay, so how are we going to have enough to be able to fight back? At the time that the fighting has occurred, it's actually too late. So we get back to the whole aspect that we have to have enough common cause, enough deterrent forces that they don't do it in the first place. And see, if it breaks down, the advantages nowadays with the type of weapon systems will always be with the attacker. And so you want to convince the attacker, no, you're not going to succeed. And so the question is, how do we actually rush to get our forces so that they now know in that 2-year period that we rush to get the F-35 set up, we rush to get the forward-looking radar systems that we have promised, all the stuff that we can do. And I'll throw in one other aspect, and that is when we look at Russia, we're talking about Russia as this threat, this entity that can now engage with a war with a country on its neighbor since 2014, can now build up probably about 22 sites that it has to support its maritime and aerospace forces along its northern borders. Remember, in this period of time, Russia and Canada's GDP aren't that different. Again, we look at the fact that Russia is usually the 3rd or 4th largest defense budget at about $80 billion. They always fluctuate between them and Saudi Arabia, and then there's China, and then there's the United States. But again, it's an issue of political will. Can we, in a 2-year period, say to the Americans right now, look, don't be doing something stupid economically. We need to buy those F-35s from you, and we need to get them as quickly as possible. So you do 2 things. Politically, you tell the Americans, look, this is going to hurt you a lot more if you start doing that, and you make it so that we can't afford it. For us, we then rush to get that deterrent capability so that the Russians don't have that strategic thought that, yeah, the aerospace maritime element is in such chaos, we can do this strike out of the blue. So it's really the 2 years.
In a perfect scenario, that's what we would do. And I'm going to come back to that question because I want to talk about things that Canada can be doing and needs to be rushing to do right now in order to mitigate this threat. which is, I think, realistic. But let's worst case scenario this. Let's say we don't do shit for the next 2 years.
Yep.
Which I mean, bluntly, as someone who's been covering politics for the last 15 or so, is the most likely scenario, is that we continue to dither and not do shit. And we sort of continue to sleepwalk into this scenario that I'm talking about, where, let's just say, as you say, the Russians have launched a couple of EMPs, they've blinded the North American forces, and they've taken over strategic points within the Arctic, and they're patrolling these things by nuclear submarine. Let's just say that. They put out a giant press release on Twitter or Truth Social, whatever it is now, and they say, "Bitches, we own the Northwest Passage now. What are you going to do?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What does America do in that scenario?
In that point, of course.
And Canada can't do shit in that scenario. So what does America do?
At that point, because it is North America that has been struck, the Americans, and this is where the deterrence breaks down. The Americans will then choose to either strike Russia directly, and then we're into, this is where the scenario really is the most terrifying, because then that means a full-blown war, which then means the use of nuclear weapons in all probability, which then cannot be controlled. That's that very low probability, but that's the terrifying one. The other one is, okay, so the Russians are asserting much greater control within the region. Again, they're not going to own the territory, but they will own the airspace and the maritime space. The Americans have two choices at that point. If we, and taking all the political chaos that's happening right now, the Americans have they will then push back in theater. And that means having their submarines attack the Russian submarines. It means basically engaging the Russian bases, perhaps along their northern locations. But again, their best way of hitting those bases would be from the bases of NATO allies. And all the northern Nordic countries have in fact been working with the Americans since 2017 onward to develop closer shared aerospace relations. And so what you'd want to be doing is striking from Finland, from Sweden, and so that becomes a theater northern war. And so again, it's a question of, do you have the confidence of your allies that you can do that? And this is where your chaos theory means, if they continue to cause problems with the Danes and the Norwegians and the Finns say, oh my God, look at what they're doing to Denmark, we can't trust the Americans, then you can see the difficulties that the Americans have. Because from a logistic perspective, if you don't have the full support of your Nordic NATO allies, how then do you counter the aerospace field that the Russians have? And that's the part where the political chaos is so favorable to our enemies and so detrimental to us.
So, but again, I'm going to play some devil's advocate here, because I'm saying in that sort of scenario, I don't see us closing off our bases to the U.S. The U.S. will have access to whatever we have access to.
Absolutely.
But let's presume that we have some kind of northern theater war, specific engagement. America and Russia are trading, I mean, I don't know exactly what weapons, but they're trading some kind of fire undersea.
Cruise missiles,
through
the
missiles and
stuff
cruise
that we're
missiles and
thinking
the
of
rest
that.
also. And it's not taking out major cities because it's in the north, but it's a violent confrontation where American soldiers die.
Mm-hmm.
And we're useless in the midst of this, because even though we open our bases, we just don't have the material or the person, the equipment or the personage or the training to be particularly useful. So we're asking Americans to expend blood and treasure in order to ultimately preserve our sovereignty and our security in the north. How does America then turn back and say, great, well, got that taken care of. Canada, it's all yours again. I think that presents a real moral challenge for this country. I think that if we get into that kind of scenario, the idea that America is just going to hand back sovereignty and control over those regions to us, who has demonstrated over generations an unwillingness to actually expend our own blood and treasure to protect it, that's a hell of an ask.
Yeah, isn't it? And yet history is the one good piece of news here. When in fact that we've seen similar circumstances as this occurred. We saw this during the Second World War. We saw this during the worst parts of the Cold War. The irony is that the record is that successive American administrations have in fact done exactly what you've said. After they've basically taken care of the heavy lifting, they've basically said, okay, Canada, here's everything back, but we have to work together. And so at the end of the Second World War, for example, Mackenzie King was very concerned that the bases that the Americans had gotten from the British, which included bases in Newfoundland, and there were other northern locations that they were at, there was a fear by Mackenzie King that we weren't going to get them back. And in fact, the Americans just said, you know what, it's easiest if you work with us on this. And they handed everything back. I mean, keep in mind the sovereignty issue that most people are aware of concerns two voyages that occurred. It's not about the land territory. Again, the Americans have been amazingly correct, not in other locations of the globe. You know, you can talk to some South Americans and Central Americans in terms of how the Americans have been in that regards. But when it's always traditionally been Canada, they have actually done exactly what you said. Now, the problem is, will Trump continue in that tradition? Now,
Well,
this is
that's
eh,
the question, because
and
I'm
that's
saying
the problem.
to what extent can we trust history as our guide here?
Well, because then we have to look at history and say, well, why did the Americans do that? Like, why, in other locations of the globe, the Americans did not walk away after they got the bases from the British. They stayed in a lot of locations. And yet for us, they did. And the argument would be, well, wouldn't that make sense? Both Republican and Democratic administrations have always made the calculations that in a post-conflict world, the cooperation rather than the subjugation of Canada was in the American overall strategic interest. They weren't doing it just because they were nice to us, because they weren't being nice in other parts of the globe. They did it because it's such a huge area. We're the ones with exact expertise. When we are driven, we actually show that we can do the right thing, such as creation of NORAD, the whole capability that we did show that we had. And so presumably after such an event, such as, and even if it's a limited engagement in Northern Europe, I mean, historically
But
speaking,
all of that cooperation is predicated on the assumption that we're not going to be freaking useless.
yeah, well, we look at World War II. We started very useless in that particular context. The saving grace is the Americans were even more useless, and they started even later than we did in that context. But there is historical precedent. You have to show that you are willing to accept the changing system. Now, you come back to your very key premise. Will a Trump administration accept it? And now, the real kicker here is something else that you alluded to, and that is that Trump is taking a torch to all the existing bureaucracy within the
Mhm,
American system. He's given
mhm.
Elon Musk, basically carte blanche to do what he will. That traditionally is the guardrail that has always protected us from American presidents that may not understand the relationship. So, in other words, if you have these bureaucrats, these military officers that say, we can't do this, the Canadians may not be doing everything that we want, but we can't do it without Canadian, willing participation. And we always then come back to the fact that, yeah, we're not paying what we should in NORAD, but we still need the Canadians with us. And that has been our history since 57. The problem is now we don't know how deep these cuts are all the bureaucrats that basically say, Canada, don't worry, Trump is making his statements. We'll make sure that things are handled well. That's the unknown. The elimination of that safety barrier, I think, is probably what gives real danger to the type of scenario that you're putting forward. The problem is, and again, if the Americans find themselves engaged in a conflict with the Russians, they're going to have to rethink in terms of how they get along with their allies. So it's going to force a rethink in terms of all this talk about, well, do we really need NATO? If that happens, NATO will prove itself to the Americans. The American economy will take a huge kick. They always do in such times of war. And so they'll be responding from that. And, this is a horrible answer to your very good question. It may be that the Americans have their hands so full with so many other things that they have to deal with after the conflict, we won't be front of mind at that point in time. And
Well,
what a
I
horrible
think
answer, but that's the reality.
well, the reality is that the only thing that's giving me any hope that Canada doesn't just dissolve in the next 18 months is that I think there's a good probability that Trump gets so distracted with 15 other priorities that he forgets about us.
Well, just think
That's
if he goes into Gaza, how does that become anything but the driving feature of what American foreign policy would
absolutely
be?
right. So it's very possible that if he's focusing on 15 other things, we get under the radar. My concern is that while that's a hopeful possibility, it also hides within it a real pessimistic possibility, which is we just continue to be complacent and decline.
Yep. And that's a
If we
real danger. That is
if
such
we
a
don't
danger.
if we don't regard some of these threats and start taking some of these threats seriously, we actually make things worse, because the longer we put off making the decisions that we need to make, the purchases we need to make, the more we lose the muscle memory and the capacity to respond quickly in crisis. And that is where I fear that the country's on this track right now.
Hmm.
So I want to talk about a little bit of optimistic thing before I let you go here. But what can Canada do? I mean, every scenario that you're laying out here says to me that we need to be buying nuclear subs from the French.
Not the
And
French.
from whom? Who should we be buying them? Because we can't buy them from the frickin' Irvings. Like it'll come over 10 times over budget and several years too late. So we need to buy them off the shelf. We need to get them quickly, and we need to put the order in a big, flashy, and aggressive way. That's what I'm hearing we need to be doing. So am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. But here's the kicker. It's going to be very politically unattractive, but it's the smart thing to do. And that is to embrace the American expenditures on capital. So you're turning around and saying, okay, America, maybe we want more than 88 F-35s. We're buying from you. We're not going to buy from the Swedes, which were, the Trudeau government actually looked at the Vipen at one point seriously. So we tell the Americans, hey, we're going to integrate with that. That's sort of a business thing that the Trump and his surrounding administrations understands. We say to the Americans, British, and Australians, hey, we're going to join you on that nuclear submarine project, and we'll get that going. That's a longer term one that is really addressed against the Chinese, not so much against the Russians, because we'll never catch up in time to respond to the Russian threat, and the Americans have to.
But we don't need the ability to actually single-handedly win a war. We just need enough.
Got to show them that we're with you and that we're buying from you, and that of course,
and also we need enough to act as a deterrent. So in order to show that we're a team player and we're putting in our thing, I also wouldn't necessarily mind having a couple nuclear subs, just one or two, kicking around, just so the Americans themselves don't think we're easy pickings, to be perfectly blunt. But my concern is that we're not going to do that.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, we see the reversal of all the Liberal candidates are now saying, okay, this is the way we do it. Of course, the cynic and all of us will say, well, why didn't you do this before? But again, you can say that really speaks to the power of the prime minister. Even if you have a cabinet that disagrees with you, they're still going to go with what the prime minister says. So, but it can't be done. I mean, the thing that's so frustrating, I think of the decision to buy the C-17s. What happened was that we knew for a long time that we couldn't depend on the Americans to get our troops to where they needed, because the Americans were using all their heavy lift for their participation in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And so, the opportunity came, and it was sort of like, okay, we're going to move right away, and we're going to get those C-17s, and we did. So it's an issue of political will. It's not an issue of capability. It's not an issue that, hey, we can't just do that because we're too small. Again, economically, we're roughly the same size as Russia. So we can do it, we can afford it, but we need the political leadership to say, you know what? We learned from the C-17s. We learned from other successful expenditures. Our history. I mean, Canadians forget that in the 1950s, we had about the third strongest air force in the world. The Americans were bigger, the Russians were bigger, but we were ahead of the Europeans, both in terms of numbers and capabilities. I mean, little Canada. So we can do it if we have the political will. And we can also do it in a way that the Americans say, okay, we can remember the fact that Canada has, in fact, always done this historically. What has happened in the last 10 years, we've just walked away from doing anything serious on that. And
But it's not just the 10 years. And I mean, I think this is the part that really concerns me, is it's the loss of muscle memory, that we have the capacity to respond aggressively and quickly.
Yep.
I mean, I look at myself here. I'm 40 years old. I was born in 1984. I have no living memory of a Canada that was militarily strategically significant.
Yeah, and
that
that's a
doesn't
shortcoming
exist
of our
in my
teaching
brain.
system. I mean, the fact that we are not teaching. I mean, we've also, and this is, both political parties are guilty of this. They've created this narrative that Canada is a peacekeeping nation. We see it on on our money. It's a celebration that we do peacekeeping. The reality is, and people like Jack Granatstein, Dean Oliver have, demonstrated that that's a false narrative. We have done 3 important peacekeeping exercises, but the 3 of them were more about keeping the NATO allies together than really for being the Boy Scout. So, everybody says, well, we did Cyprus. Well, we did Cyprus because we wanted to keep the Turks and the Greeks from pulling out of NATO and going to war. Well, we did Suez. Well, Suez was to keep the French, British, and Americans on the same page. Well, we did Yugoslavia. Well, Yugoslavia was to reassure our southern NATO allies that, in fact, that we could contain the conflict that was occurring there. Now, people say, oh, well, yeah, but what about the 2 people we sent to Suez? What about the 3 people we sent to Cambodia? And I say, yeah, we sent 2, we sent 3. And so we create this mythology in Canada. It's taught in the schools, is embraced. We are a nation of peacekeepers, of Boy and Girl Scouts in terms of the world stage, when in fact, the reason we did those so well is first and foremost, we were concerned about the allies to fight against the Soviet threat. And second of all, we did it at the best of time because we had such good war fighters. I mean, we could do Suez, we could do Cyprus, we could even do Yugoslavia because we had that capability. We had the men and women, such as those that were fighting at the medic pocket, that could, in fact, switch from being a peacekeeper to actually saving the villagers that were just about to be ethnically cleansed. The question is, of course, is how do we then break that mythology and say, no, actually, militaries count? And that's where the greater societal information, where in fact the role of you and others need to be getting that message out that, yeah, our history needs to be understood as it is, not as we wish it was. And in fact, that at the centrality of Canada's history is its military capabilities, both working in terms of the protection of Canada, but also in protecting our allies and our way of life.
Can I express one point of specific concern, and I don't know whether or not the thing that I'm picking up on here is absolutely crazy or not. One thing that really interested me was the way that Trump is framing his argument for tariffs morally to Americans, okay? Because if he were to be framing those, and I understand that there's a legal argument that he's got a wide degree of legal discretion over the border, so therefore if he frames the tariffs as necessary as a response to a border threat, there's kind of a way he can thread the needle legally there. But I'm not talking about what he's legally able to do here. I'm talking about the way that he's making this framing publicly and morally. And it's really interesting to me that he's putting these tariff threats up as a response to what he claims is a crisis for fentanyl and border security issues. I understand that those issues are highly emotive for Americans, so they're very appealing from that perspective. But we all know that they're kind of manufactured reasonings. They're manufactured reasons to go after us. So what does he actually want, and why is he actually doing it? It strikes. Firstly, I think that he actually does believe in tariffs. I do think that he's fundamentally a mercantilist. So I think that there's that. He's going up for tariffs, or will go for tariffs for his own reasons, because he wants to change his own domestic tax revenue mix. So he's got his own internal political calculus for this. But he has like a really ironclad moral argument if he predicates these tariffs on our military negligence. If he comes up and says, I'm putting these tariffs in place in Canada because they're not doing their part militarily, we got no comeback to that. Like, he's right if that's the way he's framing them, but he's not framing it that way. And that really worries me, because what that says to me is that he's trying to incentivize us to spend or fritter away money on fake problems like border security. He's not incentivizing us to put money into military.
No, you've just answered your own question. Again, the identification of the problem, and then he offers a solution that makes the problem worse.
Yeah.
To your point of the tariffs and the justification from a moral argument, again, it gets back to your earlier point about the need to know history. We go back to the American introduction of the tariff systems that they introduced following the Great Depression. It was the same thing. We need to morally protect the American worker. We need to be able to cut ourselves off from the evil of the world that is causing it, when in fact, the collapse of the stock market was a very much American self-induced problem. but nevertheless, those arguments were the ones that came forward. And so we see that being, to a certain degree, being replicated. As always, those bloody foreigners. In this case, we're part of the bloody foreigners in this context. It's their fault. But again, we have that paradox. We know the lessons that were learned from the Great Depression and the American impositions of tariffs. They hurt themselves much more than if they would have turned around and said, well, as much as we think it's the bloody foreigners that have caused this problem, we've got to lower tariffs. We got to open the economic system to get the avenues of the economic power of the U.S. going. So, I mean, the paradox, of course, is when you think of the economic activities that the Americans engaged with at the start of World War II, it's a complete reversal of the tariff system. It's saying, hey, Britain, Canada, whoever is still in the fight, we're going to get rid of any type of boundaries, and we're just going to basically build up our military in the most efficient way. Did any of those efficient ways include tariffs? No, of course, they immediately fell down. So the answer is that if you're being rational, is that, hey, if in fact that these borders are a problem, we should be embracing our neighbors, not basically trying to impoverish them. Because the more we impoverish them, both in Mexico and for Canada, the more that Trump actually imposes those, the paradox is the greater the problems become. If he's breaking our bank, how do we actually protect our border? If he's increasing the costs that we face, how do we actually pay for the F-35s, for the forward-looking radars? How do we actually manage that? And so again, we come back to this, and it's history, it's repeating itself. If you bring the tariffs in, you make the problem worse. And so we see that coming forward again. Your point on history, we come back to that again. You got to know it, and we got to be prepared. And hopefully people are telling him, you're going to make it a lot worse in that context. The problem we face, again, is he has so successfully surrounded himself for at least for this 2-year period until the congressional elections come up. But he has surrounded himself. He's eliminated those bureaucrats that could say, no, you really need to be economically. And that's the nightmare scenario from an economic perspective that you've just outlined, is the fact that he won't pay attention to history. He won't pay attention to what he's actually doing. He's going to have everyone say, you're so brilliant. And he's just going to make the problems that he says he's morally dealing with that much worse.
Or
I mean,
or the other
yeah.
nightmare scenario is essentially the decision's already been made and it's too late.
Yeah, because look at Mexico. If you're truly trying to deal with a Mexican state with the problems of borders in terms of of immigrant flows and in terms of drugs, how does that help by weakening the Mexican state? If just say for sake of argument that Mexico, by the basis of the economic hardships they face, then implodes as a state. Again, we think of history. We go back to 1912, in which the state very much came close to imploding, and some would argue did. And so we have the American action to supposedly protect itself. Can you imagine what the border will look like, what the power of the drug trade will look like if the
If you have basically a
Federation...
failed state on your border.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah.
everything that he wants to do, he's making it worse with the actions that he's taking.
I mean, Mexico and Canada are different scenarios, but what if the actual game plan here is he wants to weaken us in the short term in order to absorb us, and in which case he doesn't have to worry about our cooperation anymore because we're theirs now.
The saving grace, I take the argument, of course, that people say, if he in fact was to absorb us economically, if he cripples us that badly, there's no, it's going to be a medium term to long term before we have a recovery. He doesn't suddenly say, okay, now I've got you, maybe not nationally controlled, but economically controlled. The damage will be done. The resentment will be there. We're not going to recover from that. If he actually politically absorbs us, the argument against that, of course, is that we, regardless of where you are in Canada, on the political spectrum, we are left of most Americans. And so therefore, the argument is that, well, okay, you absorbb Canada, and then you've just absorbed a whole bunch of Democrats.
That just assumes that all of us get equal voting rights.
Yeah.
Why would we assume that?
Yeah. So again, remember what becomes important is how you set you up for the electoral college. Remember, it doesn't matter.
What if he makes Alberta and Saskatchewan a state with all the people here with full voting rights, but he makes Ontario, Puerto Rico del Norte?
Yeah,
Like
well, once
I mean, if we're blowing up the world order here, we
yeah.
can't rely on assumptions of fairness and kindness to
Nope,
be
nope,
guiding
it's
the
just
decisions they
political
make.
orientation. How do you handle Quebec? So that's the
Yeah.
argument
Well,
against them absorbing, because if you actually were to do that, how do you handle those issues? Now, having said all that, I don't think he's got the mental space to be absorbing that type of issue. And I think that short attention span that you highlighted at
yeah.
the very beginning is probably one of the saving graces. It's the
Yeah.
economic weakening of us, I think, is the more realistic problem, which then weakens our ability to actually get our act together for the defensive side. And we come
Yeah.
back to what is necessarily what we need to be
But
doing in the North.
but isn't the fact that they're engaging in rhetoric and goals that to economically weaken us in order to make us less able to respond militarily itself a signal?
It's once again the worst type of signal, because it signals to our enemies.
Hmm.
Remember, the Soviet Union did not want to strengthen Poland in 1938 because there being a talk about the formation of a sort of Eastern European alliance against Hitler. And Stalin couldn't bring himself to say, okay, I've got to talk to the Poles, I've got to work for the Poles, which in hindsight would have been by far a much more intelligent decision to make. In other words, he actively took steps to undermine Poland and ultimately signed that agreement with Hitler, where he agreed to actually invade parts of Poland. And you look how well that turned out for the Soviets at that point in time. So, any choice that we have in terms where we are weakened as an entity in the long term is not the benefit of the Americans, because the damage will be so long term. It will be ultimately serving those that are our adversaries. And by the way, we finally have an actual acknowledgement within Canadian circles of who some of these adversaries are. The Hogue Report, and once again, the Hogue Report, in terms of if it addressed the issue of political interference, is a huge debate. But remember, the Hogue Report actually identifies 5 adversarial states that are trying to undermine Canada. And that is, of course, Russia and China, which are no surprise, Iran, which we've always suspected, but you add India and Pakistan. So you have all these
I'd add
countries.
America to the list at this point.
Well, and then you add that and you just start thinking, okay, so if those 5 are trying to undermine us in different ways for their political advantage, and we have an America that is trying to weaken us, who benefits from that? And again, we sit there and just see the contradictory impacts. Like if Hogue says these are the 5 states that are engaging in the efforts of misinformation to weaken Canada for their political and strategic advantage, and then we have a United States coming along that is trying to further weaken us. I mean, once again, this makes no strategic sense from an ultimate American perspective.
Well, that's cheerful.
Sorry that we went a little over your 30 minutes. I know
No,
that
we
you
didn't.
wanted.
We can. The great thing about On the Line is that we can sit around and talk until we run out of things to talk about. But
Mhm.
basically, I think my giant takeaway from all of this, Professor, is that everything's fine. We're gonna be great.
Mhm.
Everything is not a problem.
Yeah.
We should just continue to coast.
Yes. I wish.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Just so people know, we are recording this on a Saturday morning, Saturday, February 8th. So, Russia launches an EMP between now and this being launched on Monday. Well, it's not our fault. But I do want to thank Professor Huebert for coming in. I really appreciate your time. That was a fascinating conversation, and I really hope that someone useful is listening to it. But thank you very much. And for those of you who are not aware, we are a Substack-based organization. Come check us out at www.readtheline.ca. If that's not your jam, do try and like and subscribe here on YouTube or wherever you are listening to your fine purveyors of podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and thank you again for Professor for joining us.
My pleasure.